Welcome to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. We have an eclectic pairing for you this week, starting off with my friend, mentor, and best-selling author Rich Karlgaard, publisher of Forbes Magazine, followed by Lenore Skenazy, leader of the free-range kids movement, who critics have called the worst mother in the world. Visiting Rich in his Palo Alto habitat, it was just too nice to sit indoors, so he grabbed a park bench on the corner of University and Cowper to soak up the sun and fresh air. Rich, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks, Bill.
Rich, flying out here to California this morning. I read your book on the plane, just came on Amazon on Monday morning. Fascinated with it and your attempt to take another look at success. Tell us about the idea behind this book.
Well, the book is called The Soft Edge, Where Great Companies Find Lasting Success. And, you know, Bill, I've lived my whole adult life in Silicon Valley. I arrived in Northern California in the mid-'70s at the dawn of the PC era, and I'm still here. And Silicon Valley produces all these terrific startups, and some of them become world beaters over time. But I wanted to write about companies that had survived 4 decades or more in the main, and really look at what kind of companies create endurance to be able to survive disruptive threats, economic storms, and so forth. And so mostly I got outside of Silicon Valley.
This is a much broader look.
Yeah, I wanted to write about big companies, small companies, publicly traded companies, privately held companies, across a range of industries, from fields as mundane as selling insurance to riding bicycles to more complex companies like FedEx, and to see if there were any extractable principles we could observe that would tell us if we wanted to create a company that would survive a long time. Not everybody does, you know.
Mm-hmm.
You know, right here we sit in Palo Alto. There are a lot of companies who quite logically want to build a company they can flip to Facebook or Google.
Right.
And if you can, why not? Go for it. Most of us don't live in that world, though.
Yeah, this is not the neighborhood of permanence when it comes to companies, but the ferment here is quite extraordinary. Why the soft edge, and why an edge?
I was talking to Fred Smith. This is in August 2013. I was visiting him in Memphis. And I was giving him a loose thesis for this book about soft edge, which is the edge of cultural values, versus hard edge, which is all about execution.
Analytical.
Analytical, you know, your use of capital, how fast you are, how you keep your costs low, and so forth. And Fred said, well, don't forget about strategy. Strategy is number one at FedEx. We spend most of our time talking about our strategy as opposed to audit committee issues. And a couple days later, it occurred to me, a healthy company, the kinds of companies that are built to last, to use Jim Collins' phrase, are the ones that really you can conceive of as a triangle. They're really good at their strategic base. I call it the base because it's fundamental. They know what markets they're in. They know who their competitors are. They know the forces at work in their industry. They know the effect of pricing in their industry.
They're not confused about any of that.
Not confused about any of it. And even where they're not sure, such as, is this little company coming over the horizon really a disruptive threat or not, at least they're aware of it. They're not blind. Side number two, I called the hard edge. It's really the side of execution. I mentioned it. Tim Cook, who runs Apple, was a great chief operating officer. Time will tell whether he's a great CEO. There's some doubt, but there's no question that he's a great chief operating officer. What does that mean? It means you keep your costs low. You don't waste time. You fully use technology.
Blocking and tackling.
Blocking and tackling. You use the tools that are available. Analytics and big data are two tools that are increasingly important. You have to be good at that. And if you stop there, you can say a lot of companies can achieve quite a bit of success being good at strategy and being good at execution. What I observed is that these multi-decades companies have been around for decades and decades and survived disruptions and economic storms, were really good at driving deep cultural values into their organization that would express themselves in these edges that I called the soft edge: trust, organizational learning, which I called smarts, teamwork, what Steve Jobs called taste, how you get people emotionally engaged.
That was the trickiest one as I went through the book. The trust one came out at me right away.
Yeah.
There is no business without trust. There's no large-scale business without trust. A contract will never substitute for trust. And the best contract you put in a drawer and you never pull it out again. Why don't we start there, because that's the one that I think people can resonate with the easiest.
Yeah, well, trust is foundational, which is why I put it first. And you're absolutely right. The absence of trust is a transaction tax. To the degree you have to get your lawyers involved to create lengthy contracts, that's a transaction tax that you're paying to the lawyers, and you destroy the implicit trust that might have existed before you got into that. Trust is really important on two vectors. You have to have internal trust. You have to be trusted by your employees, particularly today. It's not enough to recruit great people. You have to be able to extract their best ideas. And if your people don't share those great ideas with you, you're not going to move forward. Then you have to have external trust with your customers and your shareholders. And a company that I looked at to demonstrate this issue of trust was a company that I tried to imagine what would be the worst possible white-collar job in the world. Now, there are plenty of rotten blue-collar jobs, smelly, dangerous blue-collar jobs.
Yeah.
But to me,
fishing, right? But
to me, the absolute idea of hell would be to sell insurance. You face rejection every day, and you're trying to sell a product that people don't want to think about.
Right.
So I visited Northwestern Mutual, the $25 billion a year company in Milwaukee, to figure out how they tick. And when you think about it, Northwestern's business model is completely reducible to algorithms that describe actuarial odds.
Right.
That's what an insurance company does.
They got to get that hard edge right.
Yeah. They have to get that right. But you would also think that they would then be vulnerable to Wall Street companies or Silicon Valley companies that could do that in a better, faster, more efficient way. And Northwestern Mutual does it the old-fashioned way. They've been doing it for 157 years. They have an army of field reps or independent business people who carry Northwestern Mutual cards but are responsible for their own income and expenses. And the only way that works is with a high degree of trust. The only way to recruit people and get them to invest a lot of time
to get there.
Because it takes an insurance salesman maybe 3 years to get to a point where it's even remotely profitable.
That's a long onboarding process.
It sure is.
In our portfolio companies, if you can't onboard a salesman in 3 to 6 months, you have a serious problem. 3-year onboarding is a long time.
Well, they can be productive for Northwestern before they're productive for themselves. They can make a subsistence living in 3 to 6 months, but to really make it a career, it's an annuity business. It's an annuity business for the salesperson. You develop customers who stick with you. You build a book,
right?
And that's why people who are life insurance salesmen for 20 years can very well be the millionaires next door. They can be middle-class millionaires. They're not going to be Wall Street rich, but they're going to be small-town rich.
So they build enough internal stories that the new prospective salesman comes on board. He sees that that they're worthy of trust, that they can put the time in if it's right for them. How do they extend that to the customer?
This is where Northwestern Mutual has a huge advantage being mutually owned. It's owned by the customers. So if ever there's that trade-off between paying off a claim versus the pressures to deliver quarterly performance, Northwestern Mutual can bias that toward paying off the claim. Now, I'm not saying it's a black and white difference between, let's say, a publicly held life insurance company, but they do have that advantage. It gives them the ability to take the long-term view.
You mentioned in your book something that struck home with me because I've seen this repeatedly in my own career and in our portfolio companies about the conviction switch. You can't fake it. Something happens to an employee and it changes their behavior, it changes the way they promote themselves in the company. Talk about that.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up. You know, when you talk about the hard edge, all the operational things you do well, you're really talking about marginal gains. Really good businesses are mindful of marginal gains. Great businesses that last a long time create the situation where transformative gains can occur. And I begin the book with a story of an immigrant who had started a restaurant in San Antonio, Texas, a guy named Roberto Espinoza, put his life savings into the restaurant. Then one day he stepped onto a service elevator, fell 3 stories, hit concrete. He survived. It took him months of rehabilitation to get better, and even as he was physically getting better, he was mentally spiraling downhill because he knew he was facing bankruptcy. His friend Fernando Suarez said, well, why don't you join Northwestern Mutual? Roberto had no other opportunities and said yes. But you think about, what does it mean to join a company where you're a commission salesperson? There's no guarantee of success.
You don't win, you don't eat.
Yeah, is there a career here? And he did just well enough to keep the wolf from the door, but not much better than that. And Roberto said 3 times over the next 3 years, he cleaned out his desk. He just couldn't get past the point where he could see this as a career. He had a handful of clients, not many more. One of them died and left a wife and an 8-year-old daughter. Roberto attended the funeral. The 8-year-old daughter got up at the funeral, said, number 1, I miss my daddy. Number 2, I know we'll be okay. Why would they be okay? Because the guy had life insurance that Roberto had sold him. All of a sudden, Roberto says, his conviction switch turned on.
He got it.
He got it. He didn't feel like he was peddling something. He felt that he could be a positive influence on people's lives. And he reckons that he became 5 times more productive that very day. Today, he's one of the highest performing people in Northwestern Mutual in southwestern Texas.
There's nothing like conviction selling. You mentioned in your book that the soft edge excellence is a ticket out of commodityville.
Well, sure. If you're operationally good, you can win a commodity race. You have to. If you're Walmart, you have to have better information coming into your stores so you know how to stock the shelves on your stores. You have to win that. There is no getting away from the fact that you have to win that. If you want to live higher on the food chain, you have to become increasingly good at these soft edge skills, because that's where you're going to find the most committed employees. That's where you're going to value things like design and taste. That's where you're going to value things like storytelling, all of which can create this kind of aura about your company that allows you to charge higher prices for your goods and services. Fact of the matter is, Bill, if you're an American business, it's pretty difficult to win a global commodity race from our higher cost of operations. Now, maybe robotic-driven factories and all of that kind of stuff will change that calculus a little bit, but most of us don't want to be at the commodity level in our field. We don't want to be commodity level writers. We don't want to be commodity level speakers. We don't want to be commodity level anything. We would like to live at a higher place on the food chain. And to do so, you're going to have to become good at these soft edge skills while you're good at strategy and while you're good at execution. You don't give them up.
No, you do them all. So we're sitting here maybe 3 or 4 blocks from the Apple store in Palo Alto. You touch on Apple in your book, but interestingly enough, you seem a little bit too minded about Apple. It certainly created a position for itself that was unlike any other company. A lot of it was Steve Jobs' personality and his attention to these details on the soft edge. And yet there was certainly a different kind of a culture inside the company than what you described at Northwest Mutual.
Yeah, one of the hardest things to wrestle with in the book is that I was naturally biased in writing this book, and I shouldn't admit a bias, but I am biased toward companies that created really nourishing teams. I do believe in the value of human beings, and I don't really like bosses that are jerks. And I think that the collective result of a lot of bosses that are jerks is that you can undermine people's faith in capitalism. And if you do that, then we're, as a country, we're trouble.
We're done.
So that's why I think it's really good to run these kinds of companies that get people excited. But the question you confront is that even Northwestern Mutual and some of the other companies that are profiled that have these famously nourishing cultures that get these companies on the traditional best places to work lists, you still have to confront, well, then why are companies like Apple and Amazon so successful? Because they're hard places. They have hard-driven bosses. Even Tim Cook today at Apple is a hard-driven boss. And they're not known as nourishing cultures. And the answer that I came upon is that they are honest. That nobody works at Apple.
Yeah, you know what you're signing up for.
You know what you're signing up for. Yeah. It's like going into the Marines. Nobody expects the Marines, the Marine drill sergeant, to hold your hand. And you can be a nourishing culture or you can be a hard-driven culture. You have to be true to your nature. You have to be transparent. Nobody at the company should be fooled. And if you do that, you then have a trustworthy culture.
Makes sense.
And if you don't, it's these companies where the boss pretends to be nourishing but is really a jerk, or even worse, can't decide on a day-to-day basis.
It's like a parent who can't decide on their discipline program. You know, it drives a kid crazy.
It drives a kid crazy. I mean, half the people in psychiatry today grew up in families where their parents were possibly from addiction or other reasons, where the kids didn't know one day to the other which parent was going to show up.
Yeah, it made sense. I was taken with your description of the Mayo Clinic. I've never seen it described the way you described it. And what struck me right away was when you talked about a Dr. Wood who used the word customer and not patient. I've never heard of someone in a hospital referred to as a customer.
Well, I'm in huge admiration of Mayo Clinic. Started in the 1880s in little bucolic Rochester, Minnesota, which is not far over the Iowa border in the plains of southern Minnesota. And there it exists today. When you go to Rochester, it's a small bucolic town, except for about 4 square blocks that looks like Midtown Manhattan, which is where Mayo Clinic and all the hotels that support it are. And, you know, Mayo Clinic is the gold standard along with Johns Hopkins, the Cleveland Clinic, and yet all of them are looking into this future of medical care, driven partially by government action, but really more by disruptive technology. I mean, my goodness, when Qualcomm is sponsoring a $10 million prize to turn your smartphone into a Star Trek tricorder instrument that can diagnose and possibly even cure your health problems, when that day is coming, certainly the diagnosis end of it is coming very quickly here, then Mayo has to decide where it plays in the whole healthcare world.
Right.
And they've done a marvelous job, as you pointed out. Doug Wood, this cardiologist who is now in charge of the disruptive end of Mayo, how should Mayo disrupt itself, wisely thinks in terms of customers, not patients. Even today, Mayo consults with companies like Ritz-Carlton and Disney to provide this unbelievable experience when you walk through the main doors of Mayo Clinic. You don't smell those antiseptic hospital smells.
You know you're in a different place.
You hear a grand piano. They have noise suppression technology so that the marble floor doesn't echo like crazy. They have a lot of elderly volunteers who look out for people who look confused. It really is wonderful.
And it impacts the quality of care and the outcomes.
Yeah, it does. I was in the bar one night talking to a successful real estate developer in New York, and I said, "Why are you here?" I said, "It's not that New York City is lacking for great health care. You have Sloan Kettering, you have all kinds of great facilities.
Good hard-edge places.
Good hard-edge places." And he said, this is for his mother-in-law, and he slapped the bar table, and he said, "This is the gold standard."
They come from all over the world.
Yep. And not easy to get there because you have to fly to Minneapolis and then get in a car and drive for 2 hours.
So let's swing around to the auto industry. Take us on a quick walk from Henry Ford through General Motors, the experience with Taylorism and Deming. I found that thread fascinating.
Well, thank you. You know, this discussion about the soft edge versus the hard edge, and if you're a business manager or a business owner, where should you deploy your capital and your mental energy? And the answer is you always have to have both. But this debate about the importance of the hard edge versus the soft edge is not a new debate. We had, at the beginning of the 20th century, Frederick Taylor, who was considered the father of scientific management, took to the factory floors and took a stopwatch and a clipboard and started measuring the efficiency of factory workers on the floor and saw that there was no efficiency at all and began to develop systems that would make factory workers more efficient. The first and most conspicuous success example of somebody who applied Frederick Taylor's principles was Henry Ford in his Model T plant. Model T came out in 1908, and the Model T, it was affordable for middle-class Americans because the manufacturing processes were so efficient thanks to Frederick Taylor.
It changed the equation and changed the industry forever.
It changed the industry forever. Here's what happened, though, is that Henry Ford did not build on his early lead. The fundamental problem with Taylorism and Henry Ford's application of it is not that it wasn't successful, it was successful, but that when others caught up and began to copy it, which they could because they had stopwatches and clipboards too, then it wasn't sufficient enough to be the strategic advantage. So the great example was that General Motors, which was very far behind Henry Ford's company in the 20s and 30s, things began to flip after World War II, and General Motors under Alfred Sloan really began to develop ideas about marketing segmentation, and so forth. And Henry Ford, who was aging, was getting crotchety, was not able to keep up, and
felt his workers weren't grateful when they unionized, and that was it poisoned the relationship forever. Yeah,
and if you were in Henry Ford's shoes, you could see why he was upset. He very much raised the wages of his workers at the River Rouge plant, not out of some sense of noblesse oblige, which is often the story told, that he paid these people a lot of money so they could afford the cars. He did it for loyalty reasons. They had a lot of turnover.
Yeah, the turnover disappeared.
He did it for good business reasons, and the outcome was good. All I'm saying was it provides a lesson that if you're just good on the hard side of execution, which he was with his Taylorism and his assembly lines, that will get competed away. That's why the hard edge is never sufficient.
And he never understood the creation and maintenance of brands the way GM mastered.
Well, GM's mastery of brands, different market segmentations, the Chevrolet, the Pontiac, the Buick, the Cadillac.
For as long as it lasted, yeah.
It worked beautifully, certainly from the 50s through the mid-70s.
Talk a little about teamwork. You mentioned the two-pizza rule. which probably goes back to the days when we hunted woolly mammoths in bands of 10 or 12. How does that apply today?
Well, it's amazing how often this idea of the efficacy of small teams comes up. Jeff Bezos is often credited for coming up with the term the two pizza rule, that any given team should be no bigger than two pizzas could feed. And that you wind up with numbers like 8 or 10 or 12. Actually, the phrase was coined out of Xerox PARC. We're not far from the Xerox Palo Alto research facilities,
right down the road,
from which came the graphical user interface
that Steve Jobs stole, right?
Yeah, that he borrowed heavily from. But you see it in military special forces. The basic unit, Team Alpha and the special forces, is 8 to 10 to 12 people. You see it in professional sports. There's something about teams of 8 to 10 to 12, and there's something about pairs, trios, and quartets also that really work very effectively. Here in Silicon Valley, you can think of any number of companies that were started by pairs, Hewlett and Packard, Apple, by trios, by quartets. You think of Sun Microsystems. And there's something about the power of small teams because you can, A, get to decisions a lot faster, B, people trust each other, and they will even sacrifice for each other. You know, back when I was editor of Forbes ASAP, I was talking with Tom Peters once, and we were joking about the fact that socialism works. This may shock you, Bill, to hear that socialism works.
In groups of 12.
In groups of 12 or less. Right?
Yeah.
His problem is that it doesn't scale.
Right.
Because you get beyond 12, even around 20 or so, and then it breaks down.
You spent a lot of time talking about teams, and I thought your analysis of diversity was fascinating. You say it will fail if it's shallow and legalistic, but you come up with a different approach to diversity. Tell us about that.
Well, first of all, I consider myself a Jack Kemp conservative, so I actually do have somewhat liberal views on some of the issues that puts me apart from some conservatives, that I think that racial and gender diversity is simply good over the long term for American society. Now, you have to look at the data, though, and does racial and gender diversity on its own improve team efficacy inside of organizations? And you can't find that data.
There's no data.
There is no data to support it. There's no turning back on racial and gender diversity. Companies are going to have to get past it.
If you think that's all there is,
if you think that's all that is, and you check off the legal boxes, then you're missing the full extent to which diversity can help you. And you've got to start thinking about cognitive diversity, age diversity, experiential diversity. You want on, let's say you have a team of 12 people, it's good to have people with different skin colors and different genders. It's good to have different age groups. It's good to have right brain thinkers, left brain thinkers.
Or people from adjacent fields, even.
Adjacent fields. You don't want all prep school silver spoon kids. You want some kids who've been beat up. It helps to have maybe a military veteran who's seen combat. You have to do this. It used to be in closed economies that if you hired people that looked like you, operating in a closed economy, you could do very well. If you're going to hire people who look and think like you today, I think you can achieve high mediocrity. And high mediocrity doesn't really cut it in the global economy.
It doesn't work anymore.
Now, but I just want to add one thing here. It does put new pressures on team leaders. If you're a team leader, it's easy to default to people who look and think like you. It's much harder to be a manager of diverse teams. You want diversity in thinking styles and experience, but you've got to have this coherence and deeper values. Because if you have one without the other, then you're just going to have chaos.
Rich, in the time we have left, I got to ask you. You've got a few books under your belt now. You're out on the speaking tour. You may not remember, but 20 years ago, when you were editing Forbes ASAP, you invited me to write a piece for The Big Issue. I remember you completely tearing apart my first draft, and I thank you for it because I learned so much in the process. And now I'm writing a weekly column for Forbes. What's ahead for you?
Well, what's ahead? I love my job at Forbes. Steve hired me to start Forbes ASAP in 1992, and thank you for mentioning Forbes ASAP. The Big Issues represented the high watermark of my time at Forbes ASAP. I became publisher in 1998. I write a column. I help our Forbes salespeople open doors at high levels, and I love this. Oh, heck. You know, Forbes is based in New York, soon to be moving to Jersey City.
And here you are in the sun.
Here I am in
Palo Alto. How do you make that work?
Jeans and, it comes down to trust. Steve and his family, and now Mike Perlis is the CEO, trust me to do the right thing, trust that I won't embarrass Forbes, trust the sum of my activities, as eclectic as they are, will help the brand, help our salespeople open doors at high levels, and help us establish closer relationships with our top 30 customers.
And Forbes is going through some changes, and you're hanging in there and see where it leads.
Yeah, well, Forbes has been around since 1917, 100% owned by the family. In 2006, that changed a bit when Forbes took private equity from Elevation Partners, a firm based in Menlo Park, not far from here. And it was at that moment, it was baked in the cake that there would have to be some liquidity exit for Elevation, and that moment has arrived. All I can tell you is that Steve Forbes is 100% committed to being involved in the company and is going to have some ownership in his current role, that Mike Perlis, the CEO, is very committed to staying with the company. And we're looking for a buyer that not only meets the financial hopes of Elevation and the family, but also one that understands the value of this near 100-year-old brand and its still relevant power in the global economy. Well,
Rich, I wish you the best with whatever comes next. It's been an honor to write for Forbes, and it's been wonderful to learn from you over the years.
Well, I must say, Bill, that you are a very cogent writer and a very compelling prose stylist. So
we'll write for food.
But the reason you are is because you're such a good thinker. It's just a matter of getting your craft to catch up with your thinking, and you've become this terrific writer.
Thanks for being on the show.
Yeah.
You've been listening to Rich Karlgaard, publisher of Forbes Magazine and author of the recently released book, The Soft Edge. I'm your host, Bill Frezza, here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. Ahead, Lenore Skenazy, leader of the free-range kid movement and author of a book by that name, will tell us why you should let your kids talk to strangers, play in the street, and not grow up in a bubble protecting them from imaginary fears. Stay tuned.